Please welcome Bennett Richardson, General Manager and Global Head of Public Affairs for Semafor.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you all so much for being here, choosing to spend your morning with us. Really appreciate it, and welcome to Semafor's Tax Policy Forum, Tackling Washington's Tax and Spend Priorities. I'm Bennett Richardson, Semafor's General Manager and Global Head of Public Affairs. Semafor is now the world's fastest growing independent news platform, which we're really proud of. And our mission since we launched a little over 2 years ago in the end of 2022 has been to provide leaders like you with independent, transparent journalism to help you make decisions and do your jobs in an increasingly polarized news environment. So an important time for news like Semafor to be here. We're really excited about today's conversation and to partner with the American Council of Life Insurers to discuss some of the most pressing topics and conversations and questions around Washington's fiscal agenda and possible tax cuts and other tax reform priorities. And we'll hear from leading voices on both sides of the aisle who are shaping the debate and the critical policy initiatives on this important topic. So thanks again for being here. And now on to the news.
Please welcome Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts and Burgess Everett, Congressional Bureau Chief for Semafor.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for Senator Warren for coming. It's been a really busy, 2 months straight in session?
Oh my God. Yes, every day is like about 6 months worth of news.
Yeah, so
right?
for once, I feel like Congress may be earning its next recess.
Oh, for once, way to go.
Thanks so much for being here. Before we sort of dig into the tax element of everything that's coming up in Washington over the next 10 months, I wanted to start with some news I was just reading about, which is that President Trump has plans to try to shutter the education department. You're a former teacher. I'm wondering, do you think this can be fought, can be stopped in the courts? How do you see this playing out?
Okay, so I see this at two levels. The first one is I don't think he has the legal authority to do this. Many of these programs at the Department of Education are about student loans. They're about help for children with disabilities that are all funneled through the Department of Education. Congress created those, and Congress funded them, and the President of the United States does not have a magic wand to wave over it and make them go away. So there'll be litigation in the courts over much of this to protect the rights of Congress. And let me just say, this is Constitutional Law 101, right? Congress passes the laws and funds the enactment of those laws. The executive branch is supposed to administer those laws, and then the courts are supposed to hold them honest and make sure that they do the things they're supposed to do and do it consistent with both the Constitution and the statutory laws. So that's that part. The bigger part to me, though, is whether he succeeds or not. What is he telling us about his vision of America? What are the Republicans in Project 2025 telling us about their vision of America? And it's a vision of America that says we got to stop these crazy investments in our children, like getting them educated. We've got to stop making these investments in building a future by investing in our children, by having them better educated. And what we want to do with that money is that we want to spend that money instead on tax cuts for billionaires. Because we're sure that if billionaires have more money, that's going to make us a stronger, better America. I think that what's happening at the Department of Education is just like what's happening at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and it's just like what's happening at what I think is the mother of all fights, and that is what's happening in the tax fight. They are all iterations of the same thing. What is your vision of America? The Republicans say, let those at the top have even more and make everyone else pay for it. The Democrats are saying, nope, those at the top pay their fair share and we make investments so that everybody in America has a fighting chance to build some economic security.
I mean, you mentioned some other actions that the Trump administration is taking unilaterally to essentially dismantle congressionally approved agencies. I feel like this is probably the big piece of the government funding fight right now. Can you vote for a government funding bill right now, given all you just said?
Well, actually, we've already started voting on this. Remember, whenever you're talking about funding the government, when you're talking about the tax parts, it starts with a whole series of votes. And the Republicans have already started putting in place the votes to lay out the budget that they want to put us into. So for those of you nerds in the room, remember, this starts with, in the Senate, you have to do a package, and there's something called a vote-a-rama, where unlike most of the time in the Senate, you actually, even if you're in the minority, you can get your amendments in. So the vote-a-ramas tend to go late into the night, shall we say. At 3:50 in the morning, on the vote-a-rama we had about 2 weeks ago, I finally just said with the Republicans, okay, I tell you what, let's just lay out a basic principle of what you're trying to do to fund the government going forward. Can we agree there will be no tax cuts, no tax giveaways to people who earn more than $10 million a year, earnings, $10 million a year? Can we just agree those people are rich enough, they don't need an extra tax break now? And we had a vote, and every single Republican said, no. Okay, we got that. So then Mark Kelly stands up and says, okay, you couldn't go for 10 million. How about 100 million? Could we agree that anybody who makes $100 million in new income, as you're laying out this plan going forward, won't get a tax giveaway? And the answer was 100% from the Republicans. No, it was an oral. We did this one, and they all screamed no.
4 a.m. voice votes.
4 a.m. voice votes
exactly.
tend to get a little testy. So then Angus King stands up and says, okay, not 100 million. How about 500 million? Same result, the Republicans all shout no. Chuck Schumer tries, how about $1 billion? Could we agree that anybody who's making $1 billion in income, not accumulated wealth, just income, doesn't get a tax cut going forward? And the answer from the Republicans was no. Now, put that together with one other fact. They've told us on the one hand where revenue will not come from, but they've also told us what they plan to squeeze so they can fund these tax cuts. Just late last night, Congressional Budget Office came out with its report and said what the Republicans are planning to do literally, mathematically, cannot be done unless they cut into Medicare or Medicaid or both. So there they are. They've told us what they want to do. They couldn't make it any clearer. They've held up the cue cards. And the answer is they want to do tax cuts for the richest Americans, and they want to pay for it on the backs of people in nursing homes, I guess, who will just be set out on the street, pay for it on the backs of kids with disabilities who need an aid to be able to go to public school, your friend who was in a terrible accident and needs a home health aid to be able to survive at home without having to be institutionalized. That's how they want to pay for those tax cuts. And you know what? I'm a no on that.
I think some Republicans are already, though, showing some reluctance to pay for these programs. I mean, to make cuts to these programs to pay for the tax cuts.
Yeah.
Do you think, I mean, is that going to be the big fight of both this year and next year politically?
You bet.
Yeah.
I mean, look, here is the secret strategy of how we want to go forward as Democrats. We want to make sure everyone knows what the Republicans are up to. And that actually is more of a strategy than it sounds like, Burgess, because look at all that's going on right now. You know, it's like being in a sandstorm, you know, and you got to keep your bearings, because we're talking about renaming the Gulf of Mexico, and we're talking about Greenland, and we're talking about, good grief, 25% tariffs. Oh, wait, then there's this big exception. Oh, the tariffs are off. Now the tariffs are back on, but now with an exception. There's just a sandstorm of activity and action every single day. While the Republicans in Congress, working with Trump, keep moving forward, piece at a time, on this tax bill that's going to be the permanent shape, this is their plan, of how we fund all of our government activities in the United States. And they want to do billionaires win, everybody else loses.
Is that the message? I mean, it's a very simple message. I think we've heard it in past years, in 2018, even in the Bush era. Is that what Democrats are going to be saying? I mean, or do you need to do more than just say that for the next 20 months?
Well, let me point out, when you've got something that's so deeply unpopular among the American people, then I think it is a responsible thing to do is to point out that is what the other party is doing. And when I talk about deeply unpopular, I mean deeply unpopular. Democrats don't want to see tax cuts for millionaires and billionaires. Independents don't want to see tax cuts for millionaires and billionaires. And here's the best part. Even a majority of Republicans don't want to see tax cuts for millionaires and billionaires. And they particularly add to that. You got that one all on its own. When you add to it paying for them by moving old people out of nursing homes and setting them out on the corner? Telling them you're just done? This is 2 out of 3 Americans in nursing homes right now. They are there on Medicaid dollars because they have nothing else. They don't have a trust fund to fall back on. They don't have a ton of savings to fall back on. We are not that country. But this vision of how you build a future going forward, is it a vision of this is still trickle-down economics. Let those at the top have as much as they want and let the devil take the hindmost, or is it a vision, make those guys pay their fair share in taxes, and then let's build and invest in the rest of America?
I'm sure you've heard, though, from Democratic activists who think that's just Democrats are being too reactive in Congress. They need to be more, forward-thinking, forward-leaning, and develop their own platform. Do you worry about that at all? That because you described it as a sandstorm that you're kind of fighting through, and do you worry at all that your party is just sort of paralyzed by that sandstorm and having to just be reactive to it?
So let me say a couple of things. The first one is you are asking someone who has put out 8,921 separate plans, whether or not I believe that we should have plans.
Is that the exact number?
And describe, that is the exact number. We should have plans to describe what it is we want to do. Of course we should have plans to describe what we want to do. We do have plans to describe what we want to do. But like the sandstorm, you can't get yourself caught in how you want to execute on the pieces without putting it in the bigger frame of what's actually happening here. Look, let me put it this way. I want universal child care. And here is my pitch. We're a country that for over a century has invested in roads and bridges. We added to that broadband. Why? Because we believe in building infrastructure, clean water, right, electricity. The idea is that means anybody who wants to start a business, anybody who wants to work, anybody who wants to get their goods to market, we built the infrastructure together because the infrastructure ultimately makes us all richer because it permits the movement of workers and goods and services, right? In the 21st century, childcare is infrastructure. If you want mamas and daddies to be able to go into the workforce, you want them to be able to work a full, vigorous work week, they've got to have access to childcare. So I want to do that. Am I ready to have that child care fight? You bet I am. But here's what I know for sure. If Elon Musk and a handful of billionaires are going to get $4.6 trillion in tax cuts, and that our federal government is going to be forced to put old people out on the streets because we're not going to give them help on their nursing home bills, then there's not going to be a lot of room for having a child care discussion and building out a real child care infrastructure in this country. So I'm all in for a lot of plans and making clear to people what we can't have if the billionaires are going to continue to suck up all of the value in this country.
You were involved in the shaping of the agenda for your party in 2021 and 22. Obviously, you had a smaller majority than Republicans did, and you couldn't quite shape the tax code the way that you wanted to. Do you think that Democrats should be running on, hey, if you put us in power, we will do this. We will do our own tax reform plan? Because I think Republicans have sort of dominated this space in the past 20 years.
You know, do remember, we actually had one really important victory in that 2-year period when we had that tiny little majority in the House and the skinniest possible majority in the Senate. We had a 50-50 Senate, which only on Senate math does that become a majority, right? Because we had the vice president. And I just want to note in passing, 2 of our Democrats in the majority were Sinema and Manchin. So try that one in terms of putting together a package on anything. But remember the tax package we put together.
Yeah.
Groundbreaking, the corporate minimum alternative tax. And what made it so important is it did 2 things that I just still love about this. The first one is it specifically targeted who it was going after. It said, listen, you guys get out there and the big corporations and you report just how fabulous your profits were. You describe what a great job you've done and how your profits went up year over year. And then you turn around to that's what you tell the public, that's what you tell your investors, that's how you pump up your stock price, that's how you get your corporate pay, right? Then you turn around to the IRS and poor mouth. We had nothing. We got nothing, we made nothing. See, and here's this thing over here that we offset and this thing over here that we offset. So you end up with companies like Amazon reporting $11 billion in profits publicly, turning around to the federal government and say, actually, you owe us money. We are so deep in the hole. You've actually got to pay us. Corporate alternative minimum tax said, hey, if you're that rich, you pick a number, but in this case, you pick a number above $100 million. You're that rich, and you're making a public report of how much you made, you have to pay a minimum of 15% on the part you publicly report. And we don't care about all of the other exceptions. The reason that is such a breakthrough, one, is it clearly targets where the income level is rather than what did you do on research and development, or what did you do on this, or what did you do on that. But the second is it doesn't end run around the world of the IRS tax code that is so lobbied full of exceptions. And it just says, we're not doing that anymore. We can't. The book tax is already, there are a lot of federal rules, PCBOA, that make sure that the way you're reporting publicly is in fact in line with generally accepted accounting principles, plus the incentives are there. The corporation wants to tell a happy story about where it is. And we just say with that tax, tell your happy story. Tell it till the cows come home, but pay a tax on it.
Has that been effective since implementation?
I mean, are we starting to drag in money from it? Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's measured in the T with a trillion.
Perhaps I missed it, but I have not seen a ton of talk about repealing that among the Republicans. Are you concerned that they might try to do that?
Look, the Republicans know no limits in the taxes they will repeal for the richest Americans. Right now, it mostly appears to be focused elsewhere, but they're looking for lots of places. But look, they are caught between the 2 sides of the trash compactor. They want to give away every tax break human beings can imagine to the richest among us, but they got a revenue problem then on the other side because they want to be the fiscally responsible people. And just their proposed tax cuts right now, $4.7 trillion on top of what is already a deficit, and with higher interest rates, moves up at a high clip. That means, you talk about the fight between the Democrats and the Republicans.
Yeah.
very interesting fight between the Republicans and the Republicans. Yeah.
So we're almost out of time.
Sorry.
But a quick lightning round, just
Okay,
a yes
I'm
or
ready.
no for you.
7. Yeah.
Continuing resolution, can you support one right now?
Yeah, we need a short-term continuing resolution, maybe 4 weeks, in order to finish the budgeting process and get that done. Look, we're not going to write a blank check for Donald Trump to just have a big slush fund to do whatever he wants to do, but a short-term CR, we can put our shoulder behind that and make that happen.
Okay. And last one, debt ceiling. Can you support increasing the debt ceiling given everything you just said about what Republicans are doing in taxes?
Look, my view is that debt ceiling has just been used as a cudgel. I'm somebody who thinks we ought to get rid of it entirely. But I'll tell you this, I am not for a world where the Republicans say when Republicans are in charge and have a plan, the debt ceiling doesn't matter at all. And when Democrats are in charge, whoa, the debt ceiling, we're going to hold everybody to it and use it as a lever. I'm tired of this thing being used as a political lever. I think we can get rid of it altogether. That's my own view on this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's Donald Trump's view too?
Yeah. So
Okay.
maybe Trump and I, we can make that happen.
Thank you so much for
You
talking
bet.
to me. We
It's good to
appreciate
see you,
Good to
Burgess.
see you too.
Good to see you.
Please welcome Representative Andy Barr, Financial Institutions Subcommittee Chair on the House Financial Service Committee, and Eleanor Mueller, Congress reporter for Semafor.
All right, good morning. Thank you so much for starting your day with us. I'm Eleanor Mueller. I cover Congress for Semafor, and I am joined today by Congressman Andy Barr, who was recently named again the chairman of the Financial Institutions Subcommittee on Financial Services in the House. Thank you so much, Congressman.
Thank you, Eleanor. Great to be with you.
All right, so we got a big mandate today in terms of topics. There's a lot to talk about when we talk about tax and spending on the Hill today. Senator Warren was on stage right before us. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to say in response to, her argument that this reconciliation package that the Republicans are putting together is really just tax cuts for the wealthy.
Well, let me just start by saying thanks to Semafor and for everybody here who's watching online and interested in the debates of the day. My observation about Washington, and all you had to do is really watch the State of the Union address the other night. There's kind of two different buckets of people in Washington, D.C. these days. There's a grumpy group and there's a very cheerful group, and I'm in the cheerful group, and I'm very, very excited about what is coming in the public policy agenda. I'm very cheerful because we are on the precipice of unleashing unprecedented economic growth with this economic strategy that we have in the majority in the Congress. The reconciliation procedure gives us an opportunity to secure the border, to pass an America First agenda, to build up our national security, restore deterrence, but also extend the tax cuts and usher in a golden age, as the president says, of massive dynamic economic growth, while all at the same time sending an important signal to the treasury markets that we're going to start living within our means and reform spending through DOGE and through other reforms that will be included in the reconciliation package. So I did catch a little bit of Senator Warren's remarks, and the one thing I would just point out where there's a real contrast is when she talks about what is the vision, what are the Republicans' vision for our country, and she talked about children. I believe fiscal responsibility and living within our means is so critically important because it is about our children. I'm a father of 3 kids, and we are literally bankrupting our future. A $2 trillion annual deficit, interest payments that exceed our entire national debt budget, $36 trillion and growing. The time is now. The gig is up. We can no longer afford the spending spree in Washington. It was the COVID spending, but then followed by partisan spending of over $5 trillion in the last 4 years. And now we have weak demand in the Treasury markets. The reason why, even when the Fed cut interest rates by 50 basis points back in September, the yield on the 10-year went up, and everybody's mortgages, 30-year fixed-rate mortgages went up, was because of weak demand in the Treasury market. Consider the crisis that we're facing and that we're potentially leaving to our children right now. Senator Warren talks about our moral obligation to our children. Let's talk about that. Right now in America today, according to BlackRock, their global fixed income assessment is that the Treasury Department is issuing $573 billion a week in new Treasury issuance. Now, some of that is obviously maturing Treasury, some of it's new issuance, but $573 billion a week. To put that in context, that is the equivalent of the entire national debt of Australia. We are issuing Australia every single week in America. It is immoral for our country to leave that debt burden to future generations of Americans. We are literally stealing from our children and our grandchildren. This is wrong. People who say we shouldn't have Doge are not looking out for their children. We cannot afford this any longer. We need government efficiency. We need it now. We need it yesterday. And we need reconciliation to usher in, yes, fiscal discipline, yes, spending cuts, but also economic growth. And that's why we need to extend the tax cuts, Eleanor, because we need to grow this economy so fast, faster than we ever have before in American history, so that what we owe starts to shrink relative to the overall economy. That's our strategy, and that is a positive, optimistic vision for saving America.
So your lane in reducing that debt is looking at some of the spending that's going on at the CFPB. You've long championed legislation that would bring the CFPB under the Congressional Appropriations process, and that's something that, you know, the chairman of the House Financial Services Committee has said will be a big focus for the panel going into these reconciliation talks. So now that President Trump has shuttered the agency, I mean, what does that path forward look like for that proposal?
So I know this is a topic that Senator Warren cares about. I do as well. We have very dramatically, radically different views on this. Look, I believe in consumer protection, but I believe that the best consumer protection is competition and choice. Robust, vibrant, dynamic, innovative, competitive credit markets. That is consumer protection, where there are choices for consumers to move with their feet, to have access to credit, to achieve the American dream. But if there is a product that you don't want because it's abusive or unfair or deceptive, you have a choice to move to another product. You have a choice between an overdraft product or a payday lender. Which one is better for me? Which one is less expensive? Which one has better disclosure? We don't need a nanny state bureaucrat telling Americans what is right and what is wrong for them and their families. We need competition. That's why I think the CFPB has lost its way. That's why I think Doge is needed to shutter the agency. That's why we need my bill that would subject the agency to the same congressional appropriations process that most other federal agencies get to be scrutinized by. So Doge is doing good work. Now, I don't know if any of you all saw the 60 Minutes episode with Leslie Stahl about the Bureau, but I want to set the record straight because the thrust of Leslie Stahl's reporting was that how dare these unelected Doge people go into the Bureau and risk compromising the data privacy of all of the people whose personal financial information is in the custody of the Bureau. Well, first of all, why is that? Because the Bureau collected that data. And by the way, who breached that data? It wasn't Doge. It was the Bureau that suffered a massive data breach in 2023. 256,000 Americans' personal financial information exposed because of the Bureau itself. Doge is not the risk to Americans' the privacy of their personal financial information. It's the Bureau. The Bureau is the threat to Americans' data privacy and their financial privacy. The reason is that they're unaccountable. They are immune from the congressional appropriations process. They're double insulated. They get their funding through the Federal Reserve, an opaque and arbitrary formula of funding from the Federal Reserve, which is itself exempt from the congressional appropriations process. It is the least accountable, least transparent agency in the entire constellation of the federal bureaucracy. So this agency needs reform, it needs accountability, it needs to be subject to the congressional appropriations process. Instead of having central planners at the CFPB pick and choose what financial products and services Americans can access, how about this? Why don't we have vibrant, competitive credit markets in this country so that Americans can choose the financial services and products that they want?
So some of your Republican colleagues in the House have introduced legislation that would defund the agency altogether. Is that something you're supportive of, or do you think there's a version of this agency that could work for Americans?
So I think there is a version that actually could work, and the number one consumer complaint out there in this country is fraud. Fraud is a big problem. If this agency were focused on the real consumer protection challenges that Americans face, which is fraud, then they might actually have the confidence of the American people and the American taxpayer. A lot of what the CFPB has been doing under Director Chopra, though, is denying financial services providers the capability of implementing fraud prevention efforts. And caps on overdraft, the artificial caps on the credit card late fee. Not only will that actually hurt consumers by diminishing access to credit cards for many Americans, or driving up the interest rate for Americans, even subprime Americans who pay their credit cards on time. That's not consumer protection. But also this would have the effect of preventing credit providers of investing in fraud prevention, fraud protection for the American people. So if we reoriented the Bureau to focus on making sure that banks and credit providers could invest in fraud prevention, making sure that there's robust competition out there so that consumers could pick the service providers that do the best in preventing fraud, the American consumer would be much better protected than what's going on at the Bureau. Let me say one other thing about DOGE as it relates to CFPB and DOGE generally. There is this mythology and fantasy out there and this allegation that DOGE is somehow this unelected group that is violating Americans' privacy and snooping into their personal information and data. The truth is that the individuals at DOGE, they undergo the same security checks and background checks. They are actually vetted individuals, but guess what? These are professionals that actually know how to protect personally identifiable information. What is going on at DOGE is what they have to do in order to find the fraud is they have to cross-reference the databases in different agencies. So let's take, for example, the Social Security issue. The president had a lot of fun with this the other night, where Social Security numbers of people who are 160 years old. What DOGE is actually doing with that is not stopping necessarily checks that are going to people who are dead. What they're doing is they're identifying and cross-referencing the database of individuals who are clearly not with us anymore, their Social Security numbers, and the use of those identities, those false identities, by other agencies. So what DOGE has identified is $300 million, listen to this, $300 million in loans originated by the Small Business Administration that obviously haven't been paid back because they're going to individuals with Social Security numbers who are 160 years old. Congress could never get to this. The only way that this can be done is to give these IT professionals the ability to cross-reference these databases across various agencies. The other issue is the authority, the legal authority that Senator Warren is talking about. The agencies themselves are politically accountable. I think it's very rich that the criticism of DOGE is that these are individuals, or Elon Musk is unelected. Every advisor in the executive branch is unelected, every one. And every one of Every one of Barack Obama or Joe Biden's advisors were also unelected. But the American people elected Joe Biden and they elected Donald Trump. And let's take for the example what DOGE did with USAID. Marco Rubio is a Senate-confirmed Secretary of State. He made the decision to pause the funding for some of these programs that Congress did not specifically authorize. Congress gave a pot of money in appropriations to USAID, but we did not specifically line item a grant for sex changes in Guatemala. We did not do that. And there is a statute that codified USAID, a 1998 statute, that gives the Secretary of State the statutory authority to organize and reorganize USAID. It further gives the Secretary of State the authority to provide foreign policy guidance to the administrator. The Secretary of State has statutory authority to do exactly what Secretary Rubio, a Senate-confirmed Secretary of State, is authorized to do. What DOGE did is identify waste, fraud, and abuse and recommended to the politically accountable head of the agency, Secretary Rubio, the action that he has taken. Nothing in any of this is a constitutional crisis or illegal or not authorized by law.
Well, on that note, you and I can and do this all day, but I don't want to make you late to 10 a.m. votes in the House. So thank you so much, Congressman Barr, for joining us on stage this morning to talk about what's going on the Hill, and we hope we'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Eleanor. Appreciate it.
Please welcome David Cameron, President and CEO of American Council of Life Insurers, and Justin B. Smith, co-founder and CEO of Semafor.
Good morning. I'm Justin Smith, co-founder of Semafor. Welcome to everyone this morning. I have the great pleasure of welcoming Dave Shavern to the stage, who's our partner in hosting this event. Dave is the president of the American Council of Life Insurers, and before that was the president of the Consumer Brands Association. Before that, very interesting to me, was the head of the News Alliance. I used to be the CEO of Bloomberg Media and News, and so we worked together there, and for many years was the chief operating officer of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, so has just a vast amount of knowledge about Washington and policy. It's wonderful to have you here.
Great, thrilled to be here.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
So I know the subject is that we're focusing on is tax reform, but before we get into that, let's talk. Maybe you could set the table a little bit on the basics of the life insurance industry. Specifically, how do America's life insurers provide America's safety net?
Yeah, no, it's really important. We're the kind of least understood big industry. Somebody told me the other day that, and I don't know if it's true, but I'd like it to be true, which is the number one stated profession for undercover CIA operatives is life insurance, because nobody wants to ask the second question about exactly what it is. But the reality is that it is a big and critically important industry for the economy. We are there for people in their worst, most stressful points in their lives, death in the family, planning for retirement, disability. We make 60, 70-year promises. It's not uncommon to, sell an insurance policy to somebody in their 20s that we pay off when they're 80s, 90s, beyond. And that long-term view really inculcates the industry about how executives think about their responsibility for it. We also are, what I call the ballast in the economy. We essentially take all of the premiums invested and invest them back in the U.S. economy. Currently, about $8 trillion of investment in the U.S. economy, including the number one purchaser of corporate bonds in the economy. Again, we don't create volatility; we absorb it. We are sustaining for the economy. And probably the other big thing that's not appreciated is because we give people tools to manage the risks in their lives. We also reduce the ultimate burdens on the federal government and federal government services. We have a new study that we're putting out today showing, among other things, that just our annuity products reduce the demands on Social Security by about $100 billion. So we are the industry that is there, kind of underlying the core basis of the economy, are there for people, but also that people don't understand or appreciate all the time. And part of what we'd like to do, what we're trying to do, is tell that story so people do understand why what we do is important, and not just for you and your families, but for the economy generally.
But in addition to helping Americans manage risk, how are life insurers embedded into the deeper American economy as a whole?
Yeah, again, a core, essentially any business you can think about, the life insurers have an economic effect on them. Again, the number one purchaser of corporate bonds, so we make cost of borrowing for corporate America lower. We invest in infrastructure, in schools and hospitals. It's everything you can think about in terms of the basis of the economy. We're putting that $8 trillion to work because we made you a promise. And we made you a promise that may not pay off, hopefully it won't pay off soon, but we've got to make sure that when we get there, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years from now, that we can meet that promise. And we have a tremendous history of doing just that. So you can think about it as the balance and the force of the economy, if you will, the ballast of the economy.
So now let's switch and talk a little bit about the tax debate and dive into it.
Yeah.
Where do life insurers stand on the debate as it's emerging this year?
So kind of unusually, we were the one industry that didn't come out very well in 2017. It was a big victory for a lot of companies. Woo, tax cuts. We were actually hit with $25 billion in extra taxes on our reserves, on the things we're holding to meet the promises decades from now. So 2017 wasn't great for the life insurance industry. And I think a big part of that is people, again, don't understand, don't kind of get our importance in the industry, so in the economy. And so we've got to tell that story better. But 2017 didn't work out so great for us. And as we enter into this debate, there is, as you've heard today, a real need for the government for money. And we want to be clear that this is a place where tax policy directly impacts the real economy. If we're an industry that keeps getting punished, that hurts our ability to deliver great products for our consumers, hurts our ability to invest in schools, hurts our ability to again be the ballast of the economy. So again, people kind of celebrate 2017. We're not super excited about 2017, and we certainly would like that. Not only like that not to happen again, but we have to use this as an opportunity so people know why what we do is important and why people should want us to keep doing it.
And are there any kind of downstream impacts of the 2025 tax policy specifically on life insurers?
Well, yeah, I mean, 2017 hurt. And it, again, constrains our pricing of the products. It impacts our capacity to invest in the economy. So as we go into 2025, we are, being very clear about the fact that this isn't a good place to go get revenue, and we've done more than our part. But even as you get into the particularities of the tax debate, we always have to keep in mind what tax policies, what impact are they going to have on the real economy, and we're the direct point between those two lines. Yeah, if we get punched again, it directly impacts our ability to deliver risk mitigation tools for you and also to invest in the real economy. It is the direct impact between these esoteric debates in DC and what happens on Main Street. And we've just got to be clear about that.
So we've been, I'd love to just to talk a bit, because you deal a lot with CEOs of, obviously, of the large insurance companies, but other companies as well, your time at the chamber. sort of, I guess you may be an expert in sort of the private sector's interactions with Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
And so there's been, Semafor actually has been reporting, as of a lot of the news media in Washington, this sort of honeymoon period with the private sector of the Trump administration, sort of quite a bit of excitement, the Trump bump post-election and pre-inauguration in the markets. And then across the last couple of weeks, it appears that there's been sort of some shifting sands amongst voices in the private sector. We've reported that there's an increased sense of uncertainty and anxiety, if you will, coming out of the private sector. What are you hearing from CEOs on the U.S. economy right now, and particularly on what's going on in Washington?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been well reported in general that there's, I think, mostly a lot of confusion about tariffs, what actually tariffs will be put in place and what are those effects. There's a lot of focus on the tax bill. Exactly, you have a situation in which the government's going to want and need additional funding. How is that going to land, and then what impacts are that on the real economy? So if there's a hesitancy, there's a piece of that which is...
And tariffs have no impact on the life insurance industry?
Well, no, they impact, again, they impact the economy. So by the way, we have corporate bonds in every aspect of the economy, including auto manufacturers and the rest. So it's a very macro-focused industry. How the macro economy floats is really important. Where's inflation? Where's interest rates? I do think at a broader, longer-term level, we're all wrestling with this expanded populism from all directions, where I think there's a lot of anxiety broadly about quote-unquote big business, and it's incumbent on everybody to be kind of clear about A, what we do as an industry, and B, the benefits to people every day. And I think everybody in town is kind of wrestling with that, but that's okay. I mean, if there's an obligation on us to tell our story better, that's, I'm not bothered by that. We got to tell our story better, and I believe in the story, so that's powerful.
And we have just 20 seconds left, but I thought just to maybe you could give a little postscript on your views of the news industry.
The news business? Wow, I could do we have like 3 more hours? They're doing what they need to do, which is what they need to do. And the big kind of disruptive challenge right now is AI. What they need to be doing is suing and establishing their copyrights and their content. And I know my old employer, News Media Alliance, is doing that, which is great. But I think they've come around to doing what they need to do, which is fight for their rights and their content.
Do you think the news industry will repeat the mistakes of the social era, or do you think that
what a setup question? No, I think they understand that if they don't fight for the value in their content, that it turns out badly for them. Yeah. So what you're seeing is a renewed pugnaciousness, which I think is great, and what you need to do to come to a balanced place.
If you subscribe to an AI bot that tells you what Semafor is writing about, please don't engage with that bot.
Yeah, exactly, taking your content.
Anyway, right. David Shavern, thank you so much. Appreciate your partnership today.
Great, thank you, Justin.
Please welcome Natasha Surin, Professor of Law and Finance for Yale University and former counselor to the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. Adam N. Michel, Director of Tax Policy Studies for Cato Institute and former Deputy Staff Director at the U.S. Congress Joint Economic Committee. And Elena Shore, Senior Washington Editor for Semafor.
Well, thanks so much for joining me today, both of you guys. I would like to start with DOGE, namely its effect on the IRS, which is preparing for pretty significant staffing cuts heading into tax season. Natasha, you have written a lot about the value of IRS enforcement, and one piece you wrote had what I thought was a fascinating fact, that for every $1 the service spends on high-value enforcement, $12 in uncollected taxes come in. Given that, are you concerned about Doge's effect on tax season? I imagine you are.
Concerned is like the understatement of the century. I'm basically terrified and entirely perplexed by what you're seeing Doge do across government, but obviously at the IRS. The sort of most recent round of reporting suggests that the IRS has been asked to prepare plans for a reduction in force of 50% of its workforce. 50%. That would mean putting the IRS back literally to the 1960s in terms of staffing levels. Today, the IRS's capacity to do things like partnership audits of highly complex structures, many of you are well familiar with, is basically non-existent. It's at their partnership audit rate is like kind of 0%. They had hired a bunch of people to be doing this incredibly important work. Those people are no longer going to exist in an IRS that doesn't have the resources to pay them or to staff them at the agency. And what I think is so frustrating about all of this is, I mean, I think it's all really frustrating but what I think is so perplexing about all of this is that Elon Musk and Doge are making all these claims about the importance of dealing with waste, fraud, and abuse across government, and the importance of trying to do real deficit reduction, trying to find ways to make sure that we're able to raise substantial revenue and fund all of the necessary spending that the government has to do. Going after the IRS and decimating the agency has literally the exact opposite effect of raising revenue, of dealing with waste, fraud, and abuse. What it means, it is essentially a several $trillion-dollar giveaway to tax cheats, because it's going to mean, and you're already starting to see it in like chatter in tax world, why should people, particularly people who have complex structures like partnerships, even file taxes? Why should they not take incredibly aggressive tax positions in a world in which the agency doesn't have any capacity to be able to pursue them? And so I think it's really troubling. I think it's troubling not just from a revenue perspective. Big deal. By the way, the IRS already today is not missing out on about 3% of GDP in taxes owed but not collected. That number is going to go up when you decimate the agency. But it's also really frustrating as a matter of like democracy. Because the vast majority of all of you are wage and salary earners, you are fully compliant with your tax obligations because that happens automatically. Your taxes are withheld. Rich people who happen to accrue income in opaque ways are getting carte blanche from this administration through the decimation of the tax administrator, and I think it is terrible.
Well, enough said there. Adam, what do you make of that response? Do you also feel like there might be some revenue left on the table, or are you kind of excited to see the IRS be treated like this?
I'm less concerned. I think it's unclear where the reductions are going to come from. I have no problem with a sort of right sizing, getting the IRS back to enforcement levels before it was ballooned under the IRA. The IRS itself and the taxpayer advocate have consistently said that they do want more resources for things like answering the phones and answering people's questions in general, technology modernization. I would be fine with reprioritizing some of the resources to those activities. I think that enforcement has a lot of collateral damage. The IRS has particularly low success rates when they bring cases against in these complex scenarios, and those costs are high. They lead to business closures. They have impacts on startups. It's a burden on many small businesses, and so all these things I think need to ultimately be weighed. I think stepping back a minute, for me, the enforcement and all the sort of IRS funding debate really hinges on the broken tax code that Congress has created. If we simplified the tax code, if we had a system that was rational, with fewer loopholes and deductions and exemptions and complex international rules, all the things that the IRS spends so much time trying to figure out, we wouldn't need a significantly larger IRS and we wouldn't have a lot of these problems. So I think it ultimately rests on Congress to fix the tax code first, and that's sort of back to basic principles. That's where I think that we should be always starting these conversations.
Well, that's a good segue to my next question, which is about the congressional tax cut plan. Adam, you've talked about the need for a pro-growth bill, and you've raised some questions about whether simply extending the 2017 cuts meets that mark. Could you talk a little bit about how much further you want or think Congress should go to have a pro-growth tax plan this year?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. The extending the 2017 tax cuts is pro-growth. It is not nearly as pro-growth as the 2017 bill was. Per dollar of revenue loss, it's the 2017 bill was something like 4 or 5 times more pro-growth than simply the extension simply extending all of the provisions. And so that's why if Republicans want to talk about this bill as significantly pro-growth, like 2017, if they want to talk about it as even more pro-growth, we need to be talking about what additional things should be added to the package. I think that the 15% corporate rate that President Trump has floated is a good place to start. Permanence is also really important. Pro-growth tax cuts, the most pro-growth tax cuts are permanent tax cuts. Things like expanding treatment, expensing treatment to structures, which were left out of 2017. Universal savings accounts for individuals. These are, I think, all ideas that can ultimately make the package more pro-growth and meet that sort of messaging goal that is also important for many other reasons. It helps, adds jobs, wage growth, broader economic growth. But I think there can be a disconnect if we're not thinking about how to sort of improve the package writ large.
And Natasha, what are your thoughts about a pro-growth tax bill? I imagine you might think Republicans could be allergic to doing the things that would make it perhaps tilt more towards middle-income or lower-income taxpayers.
Well, even before we get there, I actually sort of disagree with Adam a little bit about his retrospective on the 2017 tax bill and the extent to which it was pro-growth, and as such, how we make this next tax package pro-growth, if that's an objective. The reality is that what you saw on the corporate side, and sort of the best empirical evidence, I think, is from a paper by Owen Zadar, Eric Zwick, Gabriel Chodor-Reich, and I think Matt Smith, where they estimate what happened to firms and firm investment in the aftermath of the very substantial 14 percentage point reduction in the corporate tax rate. And what they say is that translated to sort of across the board about a 40% decrease in corporate tax revenues. That's kind of what you would expect. But they say that there was totally increased investment by firms in response to that significant of a tax cut, but that increased investment only offset about 2 percentage points of the 40% decline in corporate tax revenues. And so I think as we're looking at the nature of, and it has come up many times this morning, the nature of the fiscal challenges that face this country. The fact that, debt to GDP ratios on a current law baseline are going to jump to 119. Current policy, which is probably more realistic, is going to be more like 130. You're in a world in which Social Security and Medicare trust funds are going to be extinguished over the course of the next decade. We need to find ways to raise revenue. And it is striking to me that a bunch of what we're talking about in the vein of pro-growth is real revenue reduction. And you're doing so in such a way that I worry this conversation even around all the corporate cuts and go to 15% and it's even more pro-growth. It is kind of pushing a narrative that somehow tax cuts are going to pay for themselves, when in reality there's no way, and I actually don't think Adam would disagree with me, there's no way that there is a tax package that is coming out with these sizable corporate tax cuts, but then think about everything else the Trump administration wants to do. They want no tax on overtime, no tax on tips, no tax on, it's like the Oprah of no tax on anything. And if you do not find a way to pay for all of this, you are in a world where deficits are going to go up, but that's also going to eventually constrain growth, because for how long can the greatest debtor in the world be the greatest country in the world is a question that I just think we all need to grapple with, and policymakers need to grapple with as well.
Well, let me scrap my next question and ask you if she's right here. Do you agree that tax cuts pay for themselves or not?
Yeah. I think most tax cuts don't pay for themselves, and I think we have a different read of the literature on how businesses' response to the 2017 tax cuts. I think the investment response was huge. I think the the ultimate revenue loss was smaller than some of these estimates, some of the estimates that were quoted. You look at sort of just 2017 pre-tax cut, pre-TCJA revenue projections from the CBO, we're basically back on trend if you adjust for inflation. Lots of other things have happened in the past.
But the world kind of changed pretty substantially.
There's been other tax cuts, there's been other tax increases, but we're not, the 2017 tax cuts is not the reason we have ongoing deficits. And that is driven by, as Natasha correctly pointed out, the spending side of the budget. And I think sort of building on some of these comments that debt has a real drag and has real economic costs, the answer is that spending cuts today in our fiscal environment are like a pro-growth tax cut. And that's why the ultimate, because businesses are forward-looking, they know that taxes are going to have to go up eventually if we don't right-size our federal budget. And so that's why the framework that the House has put out, that in my view doesn't go far enough in reducing spending, but is directionally correct in pairing tax cuts with spending cuts, is the right formula. One of the problems with 2017 was that it was just a tax cut and not a spending cut as well. And so I think pairing the spending cuts with tax cuts is both a good way to return more money to the American people, but also a way to make the ultimate tax package even more pro-growth and sort of get the sort of fiscal house at least moving in the right direction.
And can I build on this a little bit? Because I think, so Adam is right in the sense that it would be good to try to have a package that was in the direction of deficit neutral and sort of do no harm as a principle for this tax package or this reform moment, I think is a good one. The reality is that's not what the sort of House passed, right? So it's like $3 trillion of deficit increases, not anywhere close to deficit neutrality. But there's another piece of this that I think is important, and I am far from an expert on politics, and there are many more people in this room that are well equipped to talk about what's likely to happen over the course of the next few months. But what I'm struck by is that if we start to think a little bit about distribution as a principle that we care about, or at least want to know something about as we analyze legislative efforts, here you have sort of extension of Trump tax cuts, which are benefits that are disproportionately going to the very top of the distribution. It's like rate increases, it's like some of these provisions with respect to 199 Cap A. So it's like hitting people disproportionately at the very top. And hitting people meaning benefiting them disproportionately at the very top if we extend them. And to the extent any sort of spending cuts have been identified so far, the spending cuts are, we're going to cut Medicaid and cut SNAP. And so that is harm that is disproportionately coming to the bottom of the distribution. And I think that is challenging. I suspect it's challenging, like as the House and Senate kind of grapple with like, what are we gonna do? I suspect that is going to become challenging, just like, are they actually, you saw House members coming out last week, was it last week now, 2 weeks ago, saying, oh, the word Medicaid is nowhere in the budget resolution. That's like, that sort of stance isn't really gonna work once we start actually talking about where these cuts are coming from, because obviously they are coming from Medicaid in real ways. But I think it's actually more important than the politics. I think the sort of choice point that the administration and policymakers are going to face is like, we're at a moment where egg prices are 53% higher today than they were a month ago. We're coming off of a referendum, an election that I think you can reasonably interpret as an inflation referendum, at least in meaningful ways, where like households felt the pain of higher prices and reacted, not just in the United States, across the globe to that by sort of wanting to get out of or dismiss incumbents in real ways. And I just think it's like kind of crazy in that environment to be saying that, you know what we're gonna do? We're gonna do this giant tax package that disproportionately helps the top of the distribution. And to the extent we do anything at all with respect to spending cuts, we're gonna cut food stamps and we're gonna cut Medicaid. It just seems nuts, but maybe that is a sort of naive interpretation or the interpretation of someone outside of Washington. But I don't know if that seems politically tenable, but I also don't know if that seems, as you're talking about pro-growth tax reform, I don't know if pro-growth means hurting the middle class in that type of a way.
I think these are all, there's a bunch of just some different points in there. I think one on the distributional point of the tax cuts. When people say that the tax cuts disproportionately benefit the wealthy, really what you're saying, some of the statistics are like 60% of the Trump tax cuts in 2017 went to the top 20% of earners or something like that. Really all that statistic tells you is that the top income earners pay the disproportionate amount of federal income tax. Top 10% of income earners pay something like 70% of income taxes. So when you lower rates across the board, of course, there's going to be large tax cuts up and down the income distribution. Republicans went to great lengths in 2017 to actually have the largest tax cuts as a share of taxes paid materialize to the lowest income Americans. And that's actually really hard when the majority of lower income Americans don't pay any income tax at all. They did this by shifting how the child subsidies worked, the larger child tax credit is one way, and pushed more people off the income tax rolls altogether. And so the underlying distribution of the existing tax system is really important when we start talking about the distribution of tax cuts writ large. I think on the inflation point, I think the risk for Republicans, if they don't cut spending across the board, is that we will have a resurgence of inflation, and they will be seen as having failed to meet the mandate of right-sizing the federal government and meeting the talking points that they ultimately campaigned on. And so that's why I think the sort of spending cut conversation is a really critical way of sort of meeting this current economic moment.
And in fact, there's another interesting aspect of the spending cuts debate that we haven't talked about, which is known on the Hill as current policy baseline, namely the idea that you should essentially treat the 2017 tax cuts as the status quo when tallying the cost of what they're going to pass this year. Now, the House and Senate have initially taken different approaches on this, but we're starting to see them maybe come together around using current policy baseline, aka kind of baking in the 2017 tax cuts, and that could potentially allow for fewer spending cuts on the other side of the ledger, just to make it balance out. You may be aligned on this, I'm not sure, but let me start with Natasha. Why is that a bad idea?
It's just totally nuts. But can I say one more thing, and then I'll do current policy baseline?
Sure.
So one thing I just think it's important for us to understand is I think we should have totally real conversations about spending cuts. But the U.S. ranks 33rd out of 38 OECD countries in terms of tax revenue raised. Our spending needs, even if we don't do much more generosity, which I would like to see, a larger child tax credit, like do a lot of stuff to help expand the social safety net. People are getting older in this country. Our defense spending needs are going to rise, not fall. Like, we are going to have to spend more money. In order to spend more money in a fiscally responsible way, we are going to have to figure out how to raise more revenue. That is just like a fact. And the sooner policymakers kind of start to grapple with that fact in a real way, kind of the better off we're going to be, because otherwise you're going to be facing a fiscal crisis and wondering what exactly are we supposed to do. And relatedly, actually, current policy baseline I don't even know how to describe how crazy. Someone asked me for a metaphor that explains the current policy baseline, and I was like, it's kind of like if you have a Netflix subscription and you get it for a year, and then you're like, actually, I should get to keep my Netflix subscription forever, but I don't have to pay for it anymore. Or someone else told me it's kind of like you have a scoreboard and you decide to put zeros in the scoreboard for all the quarters you haven't played yet. It is illogical. It doesn't make any sense. And I think that the idea of saying that just because we did temporary tax cuts and came up with some ways to try and pay for them, we get to extend those tax cuts and don't have to come up with any money to pay for them is a very dangerous precedent for Republicans, because what it means, frankly, is Democrats, if they want to do Medicare for all, they can say, let me do Medicare for all for a year, and then going forward, I'm going to do a current policy baseline, and I never have to come up with the revenue to pay for something that's really substantial. So I am just as someone who cares a lot about budgets and fiscal responsibility, I am very concerned about these conversations that we're starting to hear about the gimmickry around trying to actually raise revenue in a real way or cut spending in a real way.
I'm equally as concerned. I think that to add to the sort of story of the current policy baseline, it would be like if Democrats passed their expansion of the child tax credit, turning it into basically a child UBI, $100 billion a year for 1 year during the pandemic, and then came back in the Inflation Reduction Act, made it permanent. It cost $1.6 trillion to
over
make
the
it
decade,
permanent
yeah.
over the decade, and you just sort of wave your hands and said, we meant to make it permanent all along, it doesn't cost anything. I think from a fiscal conservative perspective for Republicans on the Hill, moving to this current policy universe also sort of kneecaps any argument that substantial spending reform needs to be included in the package. I think pairing tax cuts to make them permanent with permanent offsets, whether they be tax expenditure reforms and or spending cuts, is the way to make the package sustainable and sort of staying in the normal scoring universe. Those things can be done, and it puts additional pressure to sort of right-size the federal budget. I just want to respond to one point on the broader OECD level of revenue and taxation point that I think is really important, where Natasha started, and that's you're right that we don't bring in as much revenue as other countries around the world, other sort of comparable developed countries. I think that's one of the strengths of the United States, but ultimately, if our goal is to get to look like your average European country, we should be honest with the American people that the way that your sort of typical OECD or European country funds their large welfare state is with high taxes on everyone, not just the rich, but on middle class and lower income people. They have high value-added tax rates. They have significantly higher payroll taxes. Their top marginal income tax rates are higher than ours, and they reach further down the income distribution. So if the sort of average income earner were to move from the United States to your average European country, they pay about $12,000 more in taxes every year. You can't do that with a $400,000 sort of limit of where you're going to be able to get your revenue, like was campaigned on. And so this is ultimately, I think, the two sort of worldviews. Is like, do we raise taxes substantially on everyone, or do we right-size the sort of amount of revenue, or the amount of money going out the door? And I think we can have an honest debate about sort of what our priors are, what we would prefer, but I think we should be on the same page as sort of what ultimately we're talking about.
Well, I would listen to you guys keep talking all day, but we have to stop there. Thank you so much to both of our guests for the lively discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll turn it over.
Please welcome back Benny Richardson, General Manager and Global Head of Public Affairs for Semafor.
All right. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning. Thanks to all our speakers and to the American Council of Life Insurers for partnering with us on today's event. We'll be continuing this conversation around taxes and growth and the economy at our biggest event of the year next month. The World Economy Summit will take place on April 23rd, 4th, and 5th over at the Conrad. We just opened registration for that, so if you want to join us for our biggest convening of the year, definitely check that out. And to hear more from Burgess Everett and Eleanor Mueller and the rest of our congressional team, make sure that you're subscribed to Semafor Principles. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning. Hope to see you soon.